Welcome to the Sabbath School Rescue Podcast with your host, Buster Swoopes and Michael Campbell. This week, we have a special bonus episode with Dr. Jacques Doukhan, who is the principal contributor to this quarterly's lesson on the book of Genesis. Join us as we dive deeper into new insights we hadn't thought of before.
The Sabbath School Rescue Podcast is hosted by Michael Campbell and Buster Swoopes at Southwestern Adventist University. We love learning and sharing God's Word, and together we have 18 years of pastoral experience, and now we have the privilege to dig deeper into this study.
All right, here we are for a bonus episode on the Sabbath School Rescue Podcast, and I am very excited today because we have indeed an excellent scholar with us, Dr. Doukhan, and before I introduce him, I'm going to allow Michael to do a miniature introduction before he introduces himself. So, Michael Campbell, please to share with us a little bit the knowledge you know about Dr. Doukhan before we allow him to speak.
Well, I mean, where do I begin, right? So those of you that may not be familiar
with creation.
right. Dr. Doukhan is a professor of Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis and the emeritus director of the Institute for Jewish Christian Studies at the seminary at Andrews University. He has his training from our Adventist College in France, spent time at the University of Strasbourg, did a PhD at Andrews. I think he's just gone on, and then later did some additional graduate studies in Egyptology. So Dr. Doukhan comes eminently qualified. Probably where he's of most interest to Adventists at this particular juncture is that some people have heard rumblings or rumors that there is a new commentary, New Seventh-day Adventist Bible, International Bible Commentary, I might add. And there's been one volume released so far on Genesis, and that is by Dr. Doukhan himself, who is the main editor of the series. So here, we were chatting before we started about how he's keeping very busy, no doubt, with his many research and writing interests. And then I think this is going to be probably perhaps the greatest contribution to the church is this Bible commentary. So we're so excited. I could go on and list his academic accomplishments, but from a personal level, having been at the seminary years ago when you were a professor, just being able to sit at your feet, to teach in a very relatable kind of way the deep things of God's Word and to explain it very clearly and cogently. So thank you for joining us for the Sabbath School Rescue to talk about the lesson, and of course as the principal contributor for this quarter. So back to you, Buster.
Yeah, so at this point in time, Dr. Doukhan, is there anything you want our listeners to know as we move forward, talking about the Sabbath School lesson? We're opening it up to you.
To know about the lesson itself? I mean,
well, maybe tell us, obviously you've written commentaries on Genesis, but what made you decide to do an actual quarterly on the book of Genesis?
Well, actually, I did not decide to do it. I was... So, which is not exactly the same, but...
you had to say, I'm going to do and make the time to actually do this.
Right, yeah. I had written my dissertation I wrote here at Andrews was on the creation story.
Okay.
And so that's, and since that time, I've been working on this text. Actually, in a previous doctoral, it was my doctorate in Hebrew, I touched a little bit this when I was working on the connection between language, the Hebrew language, and the culture and the thought. And so I touched that I used the creation story as an example, an illustration of that particular profound connection. And so I did later again, but then I was more focused on literary structure, the expression, the way the text is bringing it to us, the event of creation. And so since that time, I've been working on that. And of course, of the theology of creation, the event of creation itself is an important event also in my faith, I should say. So that's beginning. And of course, the stories of the book of Genesis is also very, it is still a place where I like to delve, to reflect, and story of the sacrifice of Isaac, story of Jacob's wrestling with God, story of Jacob, and also the encounter between Jacob and his brother Joseph, the story of Joseph. This book is so rich, so inspiring, so close to us. Mm-hmm. I feel very human when I read this book. So that's kind of explain a little bit my interest and my history and my personal my personality. I mean, my personal way of understanding things, right? So that relates me with the book of Genesis. All right, so that would be my kind of a justification for this particular interest, which I think this book of Genesis, I believe, and that will explain also my interest, is since it is the book of the beginning, it has also something to say about the end. Mm. So this is why I'm interested in this particular tension between beginning and end, between creation and the hope of the kingdom of God. So that's what we find already there in germ, and so that plays, of course, an important role in my interest. I will have, of course, other things to say along the way, but these are the basic reasons, why I am there in connection to Genesis. There are others, of course.
Okay. So I would then ask, what do you think are the biggest challenges that the church faces when reading not only the creation account, but also the other accounts that are found in the book of Genesis? Because, yeah.
I think you are asking the right question, and certainly the foundational question. Mm-hmm. And this is where we are struggling. And that is that really the event we are talking about took place. Whether it is simply an event. I mean, very often we hear that the story we have here is a story. That means it remains there as a story, but it doesn't have any claim to have taken place in history. So we are, and then generally I heard Christians and other people, they because of traditional understanding of so-called scientific understanding of the origin of the earth. So there is some kind of a conflict, and so generally, in order to solve that problem, many Christians have come to the solution, which is a very, very noble solution, a very attractive solution, that the creation story is just there to provide us with spiritual lessons. It has nothing to do with history. It's just something, sentimental. It has to do with your encounter with God, relationship with God. This is what is important. And it sounds, sounds very good. Actually, our relationship with God, our faith in God, and so forth, that this is basic. The thing which we often, forget, I mean, this is something very basic in biblical thinking, in Hebrew thinking. If an event is told in the Bible, and this event did not happen, there is no reason why you would take a lesson for it. In other words, in biblical thinking, unless there is a history, unless there is something which really took place, it doesn't have the claim to be providing you with a lesson, with a message. In biblical thinking, I like to say versus Greek thinking and the Cartesian thinking, we exist. The history begins, and then the thinking comes after that. Unless you exist as a human being alive, you don't think. There is no lesson to learn for our salvation, whatever message, if the event which is provided to you never happened. So if Jesus did not resurrect, there is no Christianity.
True.
If creation did not happen, there is no humanity. So that's the way biblical thought functions. So that would be, and that's the way the text presents itself. The text presents itself as a toledot, that is a genealogy. You cannot be more historical than that. Because to be historical, to exist, you need to have a father and a mother. You need to have a genealogy. There is no genealogy, biblically speaking, you don't exist. So when the creation story presents itself, it's written in the form of a genealogy, and it is called at the end of it, this is the genealogy, the toledot. The person who wrote that wants us to believe that it is a historical event, just as, by the way, all the stories which are going to follow, because they are also toledot. Genealogy, the genealogy of Abraham, genealogy of Isaac, genealogy of Jacob, and so on. If the creation story did not happen, then all these stories did not happen either. You see, so it is, you have that connection, a literary connection. Both are called the genealogy. The story of Jacob, story, and all the stories, in the creation, in the book of Genesis, are called genealogy, historical. So therefore, you can take from them lessons for your life. So that perhaps, that's the challenge. The challenge is to recognize the historical reality of this. The text does not say, you don't have science there. You don't have, if the text was written in a scientific way, no one would understand. Actually, it would be a very complicated form. But what we have here is simply a report. This is the only report of creation you have in the whole Bible, and in all, we can say, in all Middle Eastern and all stories. You don't have a report of creation. You have reflections on creation, lessons you can take from creation. But the only place, the only text in all human literature which brings you a report of creation, of the beginning, it's the biblical report. So this, therefore, is a foundational text, very important text. And the Bible begins with that.
Yes.
Right.
Love it, because if I could summarize what you're saying, which is we need to take this out of the skeptic's hands of saying this is a story and bring this back to an actual event, bring the history back into it, and seeing the genealogy that was tied into the book of Genesis. So I absolutely love that. And I'm taking notes here because when I teach the Christian beliefs class, using some of these key words and these phrases, it just reminds me, even of genealogy. So I absolutely love it. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I just want to make it a little bit more personal. You told us about the lesson and some of your graduate studies, Dr. Doukhan, but tell us a little bit about your own personal faith journey, and in terms of, obviously the book of Genesis is a book of beginnings. It's a book of identity. It's a book of so many different things, but on a very personal level, I mean, how did you, at some point you made a decision, I want to be a biblical scholar and devote my life to studying these things. But tell us, how did you get interested in these things on a very personal level?
Well, again, to speak about creation, for instance, as you know, the only biblical definition of faith is found in the book of Hebrews. And this is the one which begins a series of stories, by the way. So I would say there is something personal in my faith. When you and faith, just beginning with that definition of faith, just to learn to believe in spite of the fact that you don't see. And this is our life. just to believe in God, although you don't see him, and just to believe in that he's going to work for you, to save you, to take you to and so forth, although you don't see him. But you see, this is something which, of course, plays a role in my relationship with God, because we are challenged by that. We like to have something, tangible, in order to be able to, and rational, in order to be able to function. But here we are challenged, and we are realizing that really an important dimension in our relationship with God is the capacity to believe in spite of the fact that you don't see. And so I think this is my life, in a way, we could say, because we may, in our life, we always have challenges and moments and opportunity when we don't see things. We would like to see something and we don't see them. And yet we have understood that the fact that we don't see doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. There is not mean that there is not a promise. Doesn't mean, and life teaches us later on that what you don't see actually is the most important. Invisible is the most important, right? Love and all this relationship with each other, and so that would be my way of responding to your question. To reflect on how I think. I don't have a direct answer to that question. How does the creation story, how does Genesis, I mean, it is play a role in my life. I think I read the book of Genesis, and I must say, but maybe you can say that for any biblical book, but I think more importantly for the book of Genesis, I must say, I read this book and I always discover something new, something fresh, something fun, something significant, which I did not find. So that would be my experience with this book. I've written things, and then, I have even revised the Genesis you have in your hand right now. And as I was revising, something significant, something important was missed. So this is my experience with this beautiful book, this wonderful, challenging book. Yeah, always new. Old book, oldest book, but also the newest book.
Yeah, if I may interject and ask a question.
Yes, sure.
Hi, Dr. Doukhan. So again, my name is Franklin, but I think this topic is kind of piqued my interest in the past, because if the Old Testament is not a historical account, then it kind of depletes the credibility of our entire faith in so many ways. And I don't think we should have blind faith, but I stumbled across a documentary, maybe you've heard of it. It's called Patterns of Evidence. It's a 4-part series put together by Tim Mahoney, a filmmaker, where he goes and he interviews scholars from different backgrounds and asks them about the historical account of the Old Testament. And it's shocking to find how many people have actually lost their faith because they don't believe that the Old Testament is historical. Have you looked into any of this before?
What is interesting is that the beginning of the historical critical approach which you are referring to is related to this particular text of the creation, because they looked 17th century, 18th century, rather, a number of people, one particular, look at this text and they saw contrast between the two texts. The first creation story, we call it Genesis 1, to say it quickly, and Genesis 2, like that. And they saw two different names, two different perspectives, two different views, understanding. So they concluded that this, not only different, but contrasted, almost contradictory. So they concluded that we have two different sources. And they, of course, dated these sources, taking in consideration what they had understood from the thesis of evolution. One was more advanced than the other, and so forth. So they came to that conclusion, and that was the beginning of the historical critical approach and of the theory of the sources of that particular the documentary hypothesis, as we call it. What is interesting is that in the last few years, I should say, people have looked more carefully, and I must say that it was the topic of my dissertation. They've looked at, carefully at the text, and they realized suddenly that these two texts are interrelated. There is a connection, a deep connection, and indicating that this is the same author who is bringing two different perspectives in tension. And we are not used to think in tension, bring two things which are opposite together. But that's really biblical thinking. You begin with a tension. On one hand, you have God who is far away, transcendent God. On the other, and then later on, in the next text, you have God who is close. So they say it's not possible. They did not understand that this is the same God who is both far and close. And if you miss one dimension, you miss everything. So I would say, and what is interesting is that today, more and more people are questioning the documentary hypothesis, but they're still holding to some traditional conclusions which were taken from their understanding of the documentary hypothesis. They rejected the documentary hypothesis, but they are still holding some of its principles. So there is a contradiction, I would say, to put it in a very, perhaps quick way. There is a contradiction in this because they recognize now this is the same text, this is the same author, but then they look and they go on, and then they do as if nothing happened, as if really it's still this idea of different sources is still valid. So that's an interesting and I should say an incoherent approach to the scriptures. Right.
Yeah, thank you. And forgive me if this is an inappropriate question in any way.
No, go ahead.
But I was curious, I think it's called historical revisionism, where we kind of review and look at maybe some errors that we could have possibly made in Egyptology, Egypt's history, to accommodate other surrounding cultures. Do you think that that's something that we should consider in the archaeological world?
I'm not an archaeologist, but could you be more precise in your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I guess part of this theory is that that there's a challenge against maybe the history that's been taken against Egypt's history. So basically, the timeline for Egypt's history is off. Yeah, and that there needs to be a correction to basically. And when we make those corrections, that it does fall in line with the biblical view. So maybe that's not your.
No, that's not really my area. But you are referring to a revision of the dating which we have in the history of Egypt. Yeah, there have been some revisions. There is always. This is not a new thing. There have been in the history of scholarship. There are always events which challenge former findings. So this is not a new thing that happened already also in the past. The Bible, of course, doesn't present itself as history, but doesn't provide us with all the the details which perhaps we would like to, because you don't have my way of answering that question. If you compare the way, for instance, historians function today, work today, and the Bible, this is different. The biblical authors, they tell about their own the events, of course, differently, and they do history, right, in a different manner than today we are doing history from a sociological point of view, a total view and so forth. Now, they are just telling you what is important for your salvation, but at the same time telling you that this really took place. That's the only thing. They don't get into the details which you may have in a scientific approach of history, but it's just essentially focusing on the lesson of these events, without really providing you with all, you don't have I would say, to talk about the creation story. In the creation story, all what has been said, all what is written is right, but not all has been written. If you see what I mean, in other words, you don't have there all the things, but what we have there is, is right in a way, right? So, but you don't have all the explanation, scientifically speaking, and also historically, you don't have all the details, but all what is given to you from a biblical point of view is right, but you may not have all there. That would be my answer to your question. I don't know if I did answer satisfactory to you, but I mean, that would be my way of addressing that question. Yes.
Yes, thank you. That makes sense.
I see a hand here. I don't know, a lady, Pastor Kayla. Is she raising a hand or something?
No, I'm not raising my hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sheila always has good questions, so I'm counting on her to have a good question.
I saw a hand. All right, that's fine. All right, very good. Okay.
Well, let's talk about some of the major themes of Genesis. Obviously, the book of beginnings has something to say at the end. We have the whole quarter to unpack it, but talk to us about, and I know you've mentioned before how you're always learning and discovering new things too. Perhaps some of those things that is speaking to you, and some of these larger themes of the book of beginnings.
Okay, you want me to give you some examples of things I have found?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think, starting with the creation, I would say I have learned to accommodate my relationship with the God who is far, but at the same time is close. And also the way I worship, I would worship with this awareness of his distance, but at the same time, his proximity. So in other words, I start my journey into the Bible and into my experience with God with this tension of a God who is far, transcendent, powerful, but at the same time, very close, very near, speaking to me and so forth. And when I worship, I try to keep the tension alive. So that would be a first lesson, I learned from them, which is a fundamental one, I believe. Now, of course, there are many, almost every line, there are things, another thing which, of course, I would like to emphasize is the beauty of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is very well structured, very well shaped. And it's not just for aesthetic purposes. It provides at the same time, through that beauty, through that form, it provides us with a message. It provides us with a lesson, with a important truth. Well, something sometimes perhaps the most dramatic. One of the most dramatic, I should say, finding was in Genesis 22, which happens to be in the middle of the book of Genesis, which is the story of the so-called sacrifice of Isaac. when you read, so in that story, which is in that text, which happens to be in the middle of the whole structure, really, this is the apex, this is the climax of the whole book of Genesis. There, in the middle of this middle, so that may, in a way, provide us with perhaps the essence of the book. I found this, within that dialogue between Abraham and Isaac. Then you have this response to Isaac, who himself says, okay, let's go to Genesis 22, for instance. And okay, you have, of course, we could, this is not something which is directly in that lesson, but which is saying something about the book. When Isaac asked the lesson to Abraham, where is I see everything, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb? He's asking, where is the lamb? Because he knew the absence of the lamb was something significant for him. It was something which suggested a problem, So that's funny. And knowing, of course, looking around the environment, his own environment, where people were sacrificing their son, making their son into a lamb. So now it's as if Abraham is doing the same thing. So where is the lamb? So that's the question. And Abraham says, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb. And that's translation. If you read it in Hebrew, it means something very different. I mean, not very different, but it brings something very powerful. What he's saying here, he uses the phrase in Hebrew, it says, Yir'eh lo. That means God will, it's a reflexive. God will see himself. I'm translating now to make it clear. God will see himself as the lamb. That doesn't come through in the translation. In other words, to Isaac, he says, where is the lamb? Abraham says, God is the lamb. God will be the lamb. God will, and that's something which really struck me in that reading. Grammatically here brings this out, and of course it gives a completely different orientation of the text. That's one of the things. Of course, there are many other things. Another things which I discovered, which is very important also, it is Jacob who looks at his brother, who is the enemy, who is the one who came with the army because he wanted to kill him, and a brother, with whom he had some suspicious relations, and finally, you have that phrase, which is a bomb in the context of the Bible. When I see your face, Jacob says to his brother, it's as if I see the face of God. This is for when I read this, and there is so much. I mean, this kind of truth, seeing the face of God in the face of the one who is not only different, but also the enemy. He is suspected to be the enemy. And to realize that God is there, that's a very revolutionary thought, to see the face of God in the one you don't expect. And you have this thought, by the way, in different ways in the book of Genesis. You don't learn about God, you don't relate to God unless you relate with humans. And I think this is a thought which, of course, found its way into the New Testament. Jesus comes back to that very often. And so these are thoughts, these are truths which you discovered. And this is brought out not in the way I describe them in like principles and thoughts. This brings this in. This is brought in the context of life, the context of daily life. It makes religion alive. It makes religion close to us. So this book of Genesis is not a book of of theology. It's a book of life. It's not a book which makes you think. It's a book which makes you commit yourself, and the thinking comes later, right? So that would be my response to that question. So.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? We don't want to make sure everyone's heard. I know I have a lot of follow-ups, especially on what you just shared.
Of course, there is. Of course, the question of the Sabbath, which is an important question, because the human history begins with the Sabbath. It's so, and it's not just a Sabbath; it's a 7-day Sabbath. Actually, the word Sabbath is not there, right? So it's to make sure that it's not just a day of rest. It's a 7-day. Actually, the word 7, there is a rhythm of 7 in the creation story, just as there is a rhythm of 7 in the Sabbath, just to tell you that the Sabbath responds to creation. You have, in the context, the text which speaks about the Sabbath is very well structured, it's like a beautiful poem made of 3 lines, each lines of 7 words. And the phrase, the word 7th day is used 3 times. So 3 lines, each time 7 day, and each line 7. And that responds to the creation. Actually, the creation story begins with the number 7. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'at haaretz. That is 7 words. And in the middle, you have the name of God. If you count the number of letters, if you count the number of words, Elohim is really the middle. And if you want to have the main lesson of the creation story, that would be, something, and perhaps a lesson we could learn from there, is God. You start with God. God is really the starting point of our relationship, of life. Okay, this is the most important, right? God, Elohim. And actually, when we read liturgically, when the text is chanted, still in the synagogue today, and still, since the very earliest times, they chant the text, they sing the text. And when they read the first line and they reach the word which is in the middle, which is Elohim, they stay a long time on it. They elaborate. Elohim, so that's the start. The starting point of life is, and who we are, is God, right? So that would be, and you begin with God, right? And so that's another important lesson of Genesis. You begin with God. You don't make your second step, if you don't have the first step in God, right? So that's something important I'm just throwing here. What else I could say here on Genesis? It's interesting that, by the way, I was talking about beginning and end. The creation story, the book of Genesis begins with Bereshit, in the beginning, and it ends Bemitzrayim, in Egypt. And it's interesting that there is an echo between, you can hear that already, and there is an echo between the 2 words. And in the context of the Bible, it has particular significance. When you read the last verse, the last words, with the bones of Joseph, and we know in Deuteronomy also you have the bones, and so you have this idea of almost death, but still hope. The hope that there will be the promised land. You conclude with the promised land, right? You conclude with the promised land. You begin with creation and you conclude with the promised land. That's the flow of the book of Genesis, right? That would be, in other words, this is a very Seventh-day Adventist book, to speak to a Seventh-day Adventist audience, because you begin with the Sabbath. History begins with the Sabbath, the 7th day, not the Sabbath, 7th day, and it ends with an Advent. It ends with the hope of the second coming, the hope of the resurrection, the hope of the promised land. That's what we have. And this particular, again, attention, as you can see, again, attention, and this particular tension is all over in the Bible. Actually, the whole Bible signifies that tension. Begins with creation, ends with recreation, with hope, right? In the book of Revelation and also in the Old Testament. So that tells you how, how this, the essence of the book. I would say, just to make it quick, if I want to summarize the essence of the book, I would say Sabbath, seventh day, and the hope, and which is, by the way, the definition of faith, which you find in Hebrews 11. All right, so that would be, so it's a very foundational book from that point of view, and it tells us that our beginning and our end are, in his hand, okay? And they have to be brought together. So that would be my response to that.
Excellent. I love hearing, especially about those echoes. I took down some more notes there. Just thinking about our audience as they're going through the lesson this quarter, what particular insights do you want them to not forget as they're continuing to go over these true accounts week by week? Is there anything in particular you want them to keep in mind as they're going in that can help them garner deeper insights?
All right. So what I would say, in a way, it's what I just said. I could say, all right. But what could be what lesson? Perhaps I would suggest to keep with you is that. Is the presence of God, is the your relationship. The book of Genesis is telling us about how God came close to man and walked with humans. It makes religion a real event. I mean, a relationship with God. Religion is a relationship with humans, as already said, okay, from the very beginning. But it's a walk, it's a journey with God. And that's would say, that perhaps the lesson maybe we could learn from the book of Genesis is that God is present in our life, very close, and he walks with us, and he speaks with us, and he surprises us. I would say, and I want to maybe conclude my point here, is that at each step in the book of Genesis, you will be surprised. And if you live with God, at each step, you will be surprised by God. And so that's perhaps the lesson we can learn from Genesis, to walk with God and be surprised by him.
Love it. Michael, I see that you have something else.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. I mean, obviously there's so much to unpack. There's the creation story, but if there's one particular spot that just really speaks to your soul, a verse or something like that, it might be really hard because they're like your baby, the whole book. But is there a short passage that really just appeals to you on a personal level?
Oh,
can you choose a favorite?
It's a difficult question because as soon as I will tell you a text, another text will come, another idea will come. It's so rich. I think I mentioned, to see the face of God. I think even pre that. Seeing when I look at you, it's as if I see the face of God.
Mm.
What I learned, maybe we could say we learned that lesson is you may ask yourself, what happens here? What makes Jacob? What made Jacob capable of seeing the face of God in his brother? It's because he already saw the face of God.
Mm.
The wrestling between Jacob and God, when he saw God panim el panim, Peniel, what he called the face of God. Actually, the word Peniel means the face of God. This is his experience. He saw the face of God. And because he was able to see the face of God, because of that particular vertical relationship, he was capable to see the face of God with his brother. You will not be able to see the face of God in the other person if you haven't already had that experience of seeing the face of God, having had that particular encounter with God. Reversely, if you don't see the face of God in the humans, in the others, that means you did not see the face of God at all.
Mm.
That would be, and I think I would be able to, just take this and show you how this connection takes place throughout the book of Genesis. You have a book of the story of Joseph and his brothers. All right, you have so many. You have Jacob and Laban, and you have Abraham and Isaac. You have and Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel. You can see that the whole book of Genesis there and is about learning to relate to God as you learn to relate with each other. Mm. And I'm not sure that we have understood that very well, because we may be, as religious people, expert in our relationship with God. And then we are so expert in our relationship with God that we sometimes love God so much that we are willing to kill people for him. Mm. And we miss the point. And so the book of Genesis is challenging this way of thinking. Unless you have the right relationship with humans, with each other, you will not have the right relationship with God. That would be a lesson I would learn. I would take me from the book of Genesis.
Yeah, I love this. And, we've got several future pastors here on with us, those of you that are listening with our Sabbath School Rescue podcast. And we're just been enjoying talking with Dr. Doukhan. But I've got several future pastors. You spent your life training pastors at the seminary. And we might even have a future budding scholar, maybe a future budding Old Testament scholar. What words of advice or wisdom would you have for our students, including not only those preparing for ministry, but maybe those that feel a calling to follow in your footsteps, Dr. Doukhan?
Well, I think your question is a very, certainly very, right. It's a personal question, very important one. I would simply answer, take the Bible seriously. We are not taking the Bible seriously. And the way sometimes we study, even in our Sabbath school tradition, I discover, and even the way we are preaching and talking to pastors, we are more talking about ourselves than talking about the text and talking about him who we present in the text. The I is more present than the he. My story is more present than the biblical story, and this is why we are actually taking the place of the text. And we have not learned to listen to the text, to see the beauty, the depth, the riches of the text. And we are very shallow, very often. Not saying it's always the case. So what you ask me to that question, I will simply again repeat: take the Bible seriously. And sometimes when my field is exegesis, and I have there are a number of points I'm giving to people to provide them with tools and so forth. And in the beginning, by the way, I say, well, what is the most important tool in exegesis? Which really allows you to draw from it its message. And they give me all kinds of tools, of course, commentaries, library. Some people even say the Holy Spirit, prayer. And I always say, no, it's not the right tool. It's not the most, it's very shocking. I mean, they go through a very, even when I say this, the Holy Spirit is not, and then I tell them the most important tool in you reading the Bible, it's time. Take time. Read the text seriously. The time, you're using the time to take slowly, read slowly, learn from it. And so that's something we have not learned to do. We are quick people. We are today with the click things, the quick culture. We may miss something important. And so that would be my, how shall I say, my recommendation to the pastors. Be more slow when you read the scriptures. Let the scriptures be, revealed itself. And there is so much there. Definitely, our mind is so busy with so many things, and that we are not giving time enough, and we are taking the text seriously. And so that would be my point, which I believe to the pastors.
I love that you bring up that point, because we oftentimes try to jump to the application before understanding the exegesis, and even teaching the people to do so. We need to mirror that, especially in our pulpits, but also in our personal lives. So that especially resonates with me as I'm thinking about homiletics. So I wrote that note down to share with the budding preachers.
But to come to your point, actually, the application is the starting point. If there is no life, you will not. That's another element to complement what I just said. If you don't receive the text in your life, you will not understand it.
It's true. You need both, right?
So the existential, assimilation, is a part of your life. If you don't live what you discover, the beauty, you will not actually understand them intellectually. So certainly the application is important, and it becomes important because you take the text seriously. You apply because it's important. You don't apply because it's not important. That's the problem. Application is right. But the problem is, what do we do when we apply? Are we applying what we are thinking, or are we applying what we are learning? So we need to, and so as we apply what we are learning, then you understand. Yes, so the application, of course, is important. What I call the existential digestion. Unless you are changed by this text will not be understood by you and others.
Amen. Well,
and I hate to say this, but I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Because we've reached our time, but I hope that people will take the time, especially having this special bonus episode as we have had the privilege. Thank you, Dr. Doukhan.
Yes, thank you
for this treasured moment. I'm going to remember that line, take the Bible seriously. We want to invite our listeners. That's what the whole Sabbath School Quarterly is about, is taking the Bible seriously on an individual basis each day, on a weekly basis as a community of faith, and to wrestle with the Word of God, and not the too much I and not enough he. Buster put that down in the chat, and too often we make the biblical text about ourselves and not about God, and listening to his voice speaking to us and allowing God to change us and transform us. So, Dr. Doukhan, I feel like I've been back in class, and I just want to thank you for your scholarship and for your love for the Word.
God bless you.
Thank you. So this is a wrap for this week's Sabbath School Rescue. This is Swoop
and Swoopes
signing out.
As we put a wrap on this week's lesson, this is Campbell Swoopes signing off. By the way, we want to give a shout out to our sponsors, the Southwestern Union of Seventh-day Adventists and Southwestern Adventist University, which has for over 125 years provided a Christ-centered education just 20 minutes south of Fort Worth, Texas.
We love teaching with personable colleagues, offer quality academics, and provide numerous ways to get involved both on campus and across the globe. To learn more, visit swau.edu or check us out on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Also, be sure to join us again next week as we continue to explore God's Word. You can make sure not to miss an episode by joining us at sabbathschoolrescue.org.